More than 1,200 years ago, in 732 AD, a large Muslim army under Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Muslim Spain, entered the territory of current-day France from Spain. Somewhere between Tours and Poitiers, a European army stopped this Muslim force. The exact date of this battle is unknown, but it was probably a Saturday in October 732 AD. Before that time, Spain was still a Christian kingdom, a domain ruled by Germanic Visigoths, who also occupied an area in southern France called Septimania. Most of the rest of France was ruled by another Germanic tribe, the Franks. Since the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, Islam was spread by the sword at a lightning speed. Muslim forces moved to the north from Arabia and started wars with both the Byzantine and the Persian Sassanid empires. In 646, Muslim forces conquered Egypt, in 647, current-day Libya, and by 651, the whole of the Persian Empire. By 711, they occupied current-day Algeria and Morocco. Then, in 711, an Arab-Berber force of about 10,000 fighters under Tariq ibn Ziyad entered Spain from North Africa, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar. The Muslim force beat the Visigothic army under King Roderick at the Battle of Rio Barbate, and in 5 years almost the whole of Spain became a province of the huge Umayyad Caliphate. Soon thereafter Muslim armies started raiding southern France. In another 4 years, by 720, Septimania in southern France was also under Muslim rule. The city of Narbonne became the Muslim capital of the newly conquered southern French territories. France in those times was dominated by 3 large entities: the Kingdom of the Franks north and east of the Loire River, the Duchy of Aquitaine, nominally also belonging to the Kingdom of the Franks, but in practice independent, and, east of Aquitaine, the Duchy of Burgundy, also part of the Kingdom of the Franks, but also independent to a large extent. Despite some settlement by Franks in Aquitaine, the ethnicity and culture of Aquitaine remained largely Gallic-Roman. In addition, as mentioned before, Septimania was under Muslim rule. Not long after their occupation of Septimania in 720, the Muslims suffered a setback. The governor of Umayyad Spain, al-Sam ibn Malik al-Qurani, decided to venture into Aquitaine. Al-Sam invaded Aquitaine in 721 and took Toulouse, the capital of the duchy, under siege. Duke Odo of Aquitaine left the city to find help. He came back with a considerable army, attacked the Muslim besiegers and beat them devastatingly. Al-Sam himself was wounded and died shortly thereafter in Narbonne. This setback stopped the Muslim attempts to conquer Aquitaine for a time. However, the expansion of Muslim rule in southern France continued. Béziers, Nîmes and Carcassonne were all captured by 725. Then, in 731, the recently appointed governor of Umayyad Spain, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, suppressed a revolt by one of the Muslim officials in northern Spain. Duke Odo of Aquitaine had supported this official, and Abdul Rahman took this as an occasion to start another Muslim invasion of Aquitaine. The invasion started in 732. Plundering along the way, the Muslim army reached Bordeaux, where it encountered the forces of Duke Odo. The Duke, who 11 years before was able to beat the forces of Al-Sam, wasn't as lucky this time. His army was thoroughly beaten by Abdul Rahman's forces, and the Duke fled north to ask Duke Charles, the Mayordomus, a kind of general manager, of the Kingdom of the Franks, for help. Charles, who later was called Martellus or Martel, because of his hammer-like efficiency in beating his enemies, then gathered his forces to face the enemy which, plundering churches and monasteries on its way, was approaching the area between Poitiers and Tours. There are widely varying estimates of the size of Abdul Rahman's army. Military historian Victor David Hansen thinks that it was probably between 20,000 and 30,000 strong. It included a large cavalry force. How dangerous this army was, it demonstrated earlier in the same year at the Battle of Bordeaux, where it routed Duke Otto's Aquitanian force. The army of Charles Martel was probably about the same size as the Muslim army. It consisted exclusively of infantry. Characteristic for the Frankish infantry were their small iron helmets and chain-mail shirts or leather vests covered with metal scales. They were armed with spears, long swords and large round shields. The shields were nearly 3 feet in diameter, made of heavy hardwood and were covered with leather. They had a heavy metal knob in the middle. Victor David Hansen writes that each Frankish infantryman lumbered into battle with nearly 70 pounds of arms and armor. In battle, the Franks stood close to each other, in a phalanx-like formation, covering themselves and their neighbors with their shields. When, in October 732, the two armies met, a week of maneuvering started, during which Charles kept a defensive stance. At the end, the Muslim commander, realizing that winter was approaching, and also probably that food and fodder for his army was running out, decided not to wait any longer and to attack. Charles had managed to concentrate his forces in an advantageous location, covered by some wood, and thus screened in the front from mass cavalry attacks. They stood shoulder to shoulder, protecting themselves with their large shields, similarly to the phalanx formation of ancient Greeks. The battle lasted until nightfall. Military historian Victor David Hansen, citing a contemporary chronicle, writes, "The Franks stood one close to another like a wall. As a mass of ice, they stood firm together. Then with great blows of their swords, they beat down the Arabs." The image from the contemporary chronicle is clearly one of near motionless foot soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder, using their spears and swords to repel repeated charges of horsemen. At one point during the battle, a rumor spread in the Muslim army that Charles' forces attacked their camp. To protect the slaves and other booty the Muslims plundered during their campaign, many Muslim soldiers left the battlefield and hurried back to their camp. This resulted in a general withdrawal. Among the chaos, Abdul Rahman was killed, and the Muslim forces left the battlefield. The Franks maintained perfect discipline and didn't follow them. Instead, they remained where they stood, expecting a new onslaught the next morning. This, however, never came. When the Franks approached the Muslim camp, they found only empty tents. The enemy left and fled back to Spain. Victor David Hansen estimates that maybe 10,000 Muslims were killed in the battle. The losses of the Franks were far less, maybe a tenth of that number. Also, the Muslims now lost the second governor of their Spanish province in battle with Western Europeans in slightly more than a decade. Never again campaigned a Muslim army as far north in France as Abdul Rahman's army did. But this didn't mean that they stopped attempts at further raids and conquests in France. Only 3 years after the Battle of Tours, in 735, the newly appointed governor of Muslim Spain, Uqba ibn Hajjaj, attacked north alongside the Rhone Valley. Muslim forces took Hull and Avignon, both on the Rhone River and about 200 kilometers northeast from their strongpoint at Narbonne. The next year, in 736, the Muslims of Spain started a naval invasion, landing in Narbonne and moving inland towards Provence beyond the Rhone River. Charles, who previously had continuously been at war with other Germanic tribes, now focused, as his main target, at the Muslim encroachments in southern France. He answered the Muslim naval invasion in the same year by retaking Avignon, Arles, and Nîmes, destroying one Muslim army at Arles in the process, and then moving on towards Narbonne, where he beat another Muslim army. He also attempted, unsuccessfully, to take the city of Narbonne. Charles Martel died in 741, and Narbonne was left in Muslim hands. The Muslims also recovered some lost territory in Septimania, for example Nîmes, and continued large-scale campaigns, for example attacking Lyon in 743. Then, in 752, Charles Martel's son, Pepin, who in the meantime became king of the Franks, started a campaign against the Muslims of Septimania. He retook Nîmes took, in 759, Narbonne. In 760, 40 years after they conquered Septimania, and 28 years after the Battle of Tours, the Muslims were forced to leave the area and left the territory of France. It was not easy. A determined and prolonged effort was necessary, not just by the brilliant military leader Charles Martel, but also by his son Pepin, to free southern France from Muslim occupation. Charles Martel's victory at Tours saved Christian Europe, is what many people think about the Battle of Tours. For example, the English historian Edward Gibbon writes this in the 18th century. A victorious line of march had been prolonged above 1,000 miles from the Rock of Gibraltar to the banks of the Loire. The repetition of an equal space would have carried the Saracens to the confines of Poland and the highlands of Scotland. The Rhine is not more impassable than the Nile or Euphrates, and the Arabian fleet might have sailed without a naval combat into the mouth of the Thames. Perhaps the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford, and her pulpits might demonstrate to a circumcised people the sanctity and truth of the revelation of Mahomet. From such calamities was Christendom delivered by the genius and fortune of one man. And the modern historian William Watson writes this in 1993. The rapid Muslim conquest of Palestine, Syria, Egypt and the North African coast all the way to Morocco in the 7th century resulted in the permanent imposition by force of Islamic culture onto a previously Christian and largely non-Arab base. The Visigothic kingdom fell to Muslim conquerors in a single battle on the Rio Barbate in 711, and the Hispanic Christian population took 7 long centuries to regain control of the Iberian Peninsula. Had Charles Martel suffered at Tours Poitiers the fate of King Roderick at the Rio Barbate, it is doubtful that a do-nothing sovereign of the Merovingian realm could have later succeeded where his talented Mayordomus had failed. Indeed, as Charles was the progenitor of the Carolingian line of Frankish rulers and grandfather of Charlemagne, one can even say with a degree of certainty that the subsequent history of the West would have proceeded along vastly different currents had Abdul Rahman been victorious at Tours Poitiers in 732. However, some other modern historians downplay the importance of the battle. For example, Slovenian scholar Thomas Mastnak thinks that the real confrontation at the time of the battle was between European dukes. The battle itself was only important so far as it was part of this confrontation. He writes this: modern historians have constructed a myth presenting this victory as having saved Christian Europe from the Muslims. Edward Gibbon, for example, called Charles Martel the savior of Christendom in the battle near Poitiers, an encounter that changed the history of the world. This myth has survived well into our own times. Contemporaries of the battle, however, did not overstate its significance. The continuators of Fred Agar's chronicle, who probably wrote in the mid-8th century, pictured the battle as just one of many military encounters between Christians and Saracens, moreover, as only one in a series of wars fought by Frankish princes for booty and territory. One of Fred Agar's continuators presented the Battle of Poitiers as what it really was, an episode in the struggle between Christian princes as the Carolingians strove to bring Aquitaine under their rule. The implication is that Muslims were not a real danger. Other modern historians like Alessandro Barbero accept the confrontation with Muslims as a separate process, but they maintain that Abdul Rahman's invasion was merely a raid. Barbero writes, today, historians tend to play down the significance of the Battle of Poitiers, pointing out that the purpose of the Muslim force defeated by Charles Martel was not to conquer the Frankish kingdom, but simply to pillage the wealthy monastery of Saint Martin of Tours. Again, the implication is that the Muslim invasion was not a really dangerous event. Again others, like the historian Philip Khoury-Hitti, maintain that by the time of the Battle of Tours the Muslim forces were overstretched. Even if they had wanted to conquer more European territory, they would not have been able to do so. Thus, Philip Coury-Hitty writes, later legends embellished this day at Poitiers or Tours, greatly exaggerating its historical importance. In reality, nothing was decided on the battlefield of Tours. The Arab-Berber wave, already almost 1,000 miles from its starting point in Gibraltar, had reached a natural standstill. It had lost its momentum and spent itself. Again, the implication is the same: Muslims were no real danger. Knowledge of many historical events is very fragmentary and ambiguous. This is true for the Battle of Tours. A historian trying to make sense of such events is in a similar situation as a person taking a Rorschach test, which consists of interpreting ambiguous figures like the one shown here. If the historian has strong ideological motivations, these will often influence how the historian describes and evaluates such ambiguous past events. Similarly, as personality factors are assumed to influence a person's responses in a Rorschach test. Modern academic historians tend to be heavily leftist. This is shown, for example, by the results of a recent poll among more than 5,000 professors at 51 elite colleges in the United States. They were asked about their political affiliation, Democrat versus Republican. In all departments, Democrats were the majority, often grotesquely so. The chart shows the Democrat to Republican ratios in different college departments. In history departments there were 17.4 times more faculty members with a Democratic affiliation than with a Republican affiliation. It is probably safe to assume that historians in other countries of the Western world have a similarly leftist orientation as their colleagues at these elite United States colleges. Thus, maybe it is no coincidence that the last three interpretations of the battle, described before, which downplay its importance, fit well into the politically correct, leftist mindset of our time. Current political correctness and leftist thinking tends to view Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, as a highly developed, tolerant society, in many respects better than contemporary European societies. Abdul Rahman, the opponent of Charles Martel in the Battle of Tours, came from this society. How could then he and his army pose a real threat to European culture? To see them as a threat seems to border on Islamophobia. Thus, according to these interpretations, the Muslims were no real danger for European culture. In fact, as Thomas Mastnak seems to be saying, the main source of conflict in Europe were the Europeans themselves in their fighting with each other. The conflict with the Muslims had an importance only in that context. But, whether they fit the current politically correct narrative or not, whether they stem from leftist scholars or not, the important question is, are these interpretations of the Battle of Tours correct? Was Abdul Rahman's invasion really as unimportant and as harmless as these scholars assert? Let's try to answer this question by presenting a less politically correct, and hopefully more realistic, interpretation of the battle. It will show why the interpretations downplaying the battle's importance are wrong, and why the earlier analyses of the battle by Edward Gibbon and William Watson were essentially correct. Winning the Battle of Tours by Charles Martel didn't have large immediate effects. Much remained the same. Duke Otto returned to Aquitaine. Charles Martel remained in northern France. The Muslims recovered from the battle, just as they had recovered from their huge defeat 11 years earlier at Toulouse. 3 years after their defeat at Tours, they were invading and conquering in southern France again. However, had Charles Martel lost the Battle of Tours, it would have very probably changed European history decisively. The original intention behind Abdul Rahman's invasion might have been a myriad as Alessandro Barbera describes it. However, this doesn't mean that it was less dangerous because of that. Had the Muslims won the Battle of Tours, there is no reason why they could not have turned this raid into a conquest of at least Aquitaine. Having beaten Duke Otto at Bordeaux earlier in the year decisively, there was nobody there to oppose them. They then could have used a newly won Aquitaine as a basis for further conquests to the north and to the east. They would have had at least two reasons to follow up their aid with a lasting conquest, material and religious. The material reason is obvious. They would have increased their property, tax base and power in Europe. The religious reason is the demand of Islam to fight unbelievers and subjugate them to its rule. Events after a Muslim victory at the Battle of Tours would probably have followed the same pattern as observed in many other places invaded by Muslims. After initial successful raids, Muslims stayed either permanently or for long periods of time, until they were expelled, often under great difficulties. This happened, for example, in southern France around Narbonne and later in southern Italy and in Sicily, where they remained for some 260 years until the Normans finally expelled them. Further to the east it was the same. As historian Hugh Kennedy puts it, as the people of Central Asia were finding out at exactly this time, Arab raids could be a prelude to more lasting conquests. Those conquests in Central Asia made the place Islamic, which it remains till today. Nothing indicates that there was a natural standstill in Muslim conquests or that Muslim expansion spent itself, as suggested by Philip Currie Hetty. On the contrary, they demonstrated lots of initiative and energy in raiding and conquering, even after battles like Toulouse in 721 and Tours in 732, both of which resulted in catastrophic losses for them. One can easily imagine how this would have intensified had they won the Battle of Tours. It is true, there were internal troubles, like insurrections, that the Muslims of Spain were facing. But this did not stop them from expanding into France. For example, immediately before his Tours campaign, Abdul Rahman had beaten down a revolt in Spain. The next great upheaval in the Muslim world, the demise of the Umayyad Caliphate and the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate, was in 732, still about 20 years away. Had they won the Battle of Tours, this would have given them ample time to consolidate their rule in Aquitaine and maybe elsewhere further to the north, too. Muslims had shown in Spain and in southern France how quickly they were able to conquer large European territories and then to establish themselves in those territories. Another sign that there was no natural standstill in Muslim conquests was that they returned to southern France later, in 887, about 130 years after they were expelled by King Pepin from Septimania. Muslims from Spain founded a colony further to the east in the Gulf of Saint-Tropez, in Provence. During the decades that followed, the colony, called Fraxenitum or Fraxinet, established itself as a menace for Provence, raiding and enslaving the Christian population, while enlarging the area it controlled. The Muslims of Fraxinet had a settlement near Grenoble, almost 300 kilometers to the north from Saint-Tropez. They also settled near Nice and occupied Toulon. They were finally expelled 86 years later, in 973, by Count William of Provence. Thus, it was not a natural standstill that stopped further Muslim conquests in France but the application of counter-force, as demonstrated by Charles Martel at Tours, by his son, King Pepin in Septimania, and by Count William of Provence in Fraxinet. Winning the Battle of Tours by Charles was important because it initiated this process and also made later successes possible. Thus, the Muslim invasion led by Abdul Rahman was very dangerous indeed for Europe. Whether that danger was going to be realized depended on the outcome of the battle at Tours. Battles always bear the risk of defeat. In a similar historical example, the Anglo-Saxon forces of King Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 were also formed in a wall of shields and faced Norman cavalry attacking them. Though the Anglo-Saxons at Hastings were not as disciplined as the Frankish soldiers of Charles Martel at Tours, the battle was ultimately decided in favor of the Normans when King Harold was killed. The same thing could have happened at Tours, too, leading to a defeat of the Franks. Winning that battle was important because losing it would have changed European history decisively. Losing the battle by Charles Martel would have probably resulted in Muslims conquering at least a large chunk of territory inside France. If one realizes that it took 40 years to evict Muslims from the small territory of Septimania in southern France, one can imagine how much longer such a reconquest would have taken, with Muslims ruling 1/3 or more of France. One can also easily imagine how this would have affected Reconquista further to the south, in Spain. As it happened, the full reconquest of Spain by the Christians took 781 years. How much longer would this have taken if Muslims had conquered not only Spain but a large part of France too? Winning the Battle of Tours alone wasn't enough to ban the Muslim danger in southern France. Further determined effort was needed to achieve that. This was helped by the fact that the confrontation with Muslims seems to have focused Charles Martel's mind on the Muslim danger. This led Charles, and later his son Pepin, to maintain the pressure until, in 760, almost 30 years after the Battle of Tours, all Muslim occupation forces were eventually evicted from France.